you've written in some of your reporting, we've been able to read that the business elite in Syria, so critical to the Assad regime, may be starting to distance itself from the government. Are they preparing for a post-Assad Syria?
I think you are, Hala, seeing some tentative signs of the business elite at least trying to imagine the day after. I don't think that the tide has necessarily turned, that the momentum is decisive by any means, but you are seeing some outreach, even among one businessman that draws from the Alawite minority, of course, the minority from which President Assad draws most of its support. I think what you're seeing most often is elite in Damascus trying to have it both ways, maintaining their ties with the government, but also reaching out to the opposition just in case.
Right. Let's talk about what the future may hold for this regime. And in your recent article on Syria, Louis Hussein, one prominent opposition figure who hoped at one point, I don't know if it's still the case, that political or a dialogue sort of strategy might work in Syria, said the government is counting on its military and it could take a very long time before it uses up all its resources. And therein lies the key. That is the military support for the regime, right?
That's right. And I think Louis was very grim when we were talking to him yesterday. There's a lot of fear of what's ahead on his part, that the military seems to, or the government at least, seems to have chosen the military option in trying to crush this uprising. A lot of activists had expected Ramadan, the Muslim holy month that's underway right now, to see an escalation of the uprising. Instead, what we've seen is the government relying even more forcefully on the military to try to crush it in cities like Deir ez-Zor and Hama, even in Homs, where we saw perhaps a dozen killed today. This seems to be an escalation and repression, and there doesn't seem to be a political alternative at this point.
You went to Hama before the military offensive of July 31st. You described it as a microcosm of what a post-Assad Syria could look like, because the city was under siege, but there was no security force presence in the center. What did you make of this offensive and the reaction of the residents of Hama to it?
I think when I saw Hama last month, it was probably one of the most remarkable moments in years in Syria. You really did have, I don't want to say the city was liberated, but there was free space. People were talking, they were arguing. There were new kinds of leadership that were beginning to emerge among the youth, among the elite in the city. A cleric there, the head of a mosque there, was actually negotiating with the government, where power was a dialogue rather than a monologue that we've been so accustomed to. I think that was very threatening to the regime, and it had, in some ways, I think the calculus among government officials was they had to crush this before it provided momentum to other cities. We saw that in Deir ez-Zor a little bit. It did that. It did crush it. But one thing we've learned so far during this uprising is that once the military withdraws, the protests begin again. And I think that's something we're going to have to watch in the coming weeks as the military does pull back from these cities. What happens with these protests?
And what happens with the protesters, those who are in areas where perhaps there is a possibility they might start taking up arms? So could we start seeing the beginning of a civil conflict inside of Syria, do you think?
I think that's a great question, Hala. I think we're already seeing tentative signs of that. Of course, Deir ez-Zor in eastern Syria, populated by extended clans. They're very well armed, and they're also protective of their independence. For months, no one thought the military was actually going to go into this city, given how combustible it is. We've heard reports today of gunshots fired at a house of a businessman very close to the government of President Assad. That would also mark a dangerous sign, in that the residents of Homs have taken up arms and are willing to fight back. I think there is a fear out there that the longer this goes on, the more difficult it is going to be to avoid violence.
Anthony Shadid of the New York Times, always a pleasure talking with you. Thanks very much for joining us on CNN today.
My pleasure.